When the mirrored elevator opened onto the 34th floor of Callister and Row, New York had not quite finished rubbing the sleep from its eyes. Overnight rain had burnished the streets to a dark sheen. The river looked like ink. On the marble of the lobby, the rhythm of urgent heels clicked a kind of Morse code late while ties were tugged and tightened, faces smoothed into the corporate half-smile taught by necessity, not belief. Word had moved faster than the elevators. The new chief executive was on his way up. Not the interim, not a caretaker. Damon Prescott, the former Army officer who'd built a fortune in real estate by buying problems other men were too timid to touch, had accepted the board's invitation to take the wheel. He had a reputation for 3-line emails that felt like verdicts, and for replacing strategy decks with a single sentence. Don't insult the market with mediocrity. The boardroom was glass on 2 sides, and the city's skyline pressed its forehead there, listening. Executive directors took their seats with a careful choreography that disguised anxiety as poise. Phones went face down. A carafe of water sweated upon a lacquered tray. The receptionist, separated by a glass wall and years of practiced invisibility, pretended to type while watching for the moment a story would begin. It began quietly. Damon walked in, the room rising with the soft rustle of expensive fabrics. He did not wave them down. He crossed to the head of the table, laid a slim leather portfolio upon its surface, and drew out a single sheet. He did not speak at first. He set the page on the glass and studied it with a patience that made a few spines curve in on themselves. The sheet held a design that could be called audacious if audacity did not sound like a mask. It felt truer to say it was alive. A sustainable innovation center. Those words had passed through this floor like tired commuters for years. Yet here they woke with purpose. Light traveled as if invited. Curves met angles like old friends who had finally forgiven one another. A central atrium drank the sun. Air moved in corridors formed by solar glass panels. Gardens nested upon terraces like birds that had found a safer city to sing in. It was graceful, muscular, inevitable. Damon let a finger trace the path of the prevailing wind indicated by a set of nearly invisible arrows. He looked up then. When he spoke, his voice was clean as steel. "This wasn't done by any of you, was it?" Not a question mark, but a period shaped like a blade. The quiet that followed had weight. It settled upon shoulders that already had too much. "Bring me the real architect, Utesson," he said. "Now." Nobody moved. Not the director with the sandpaper cough. Not the woman from finance who never admitted surprise as a point of pride. Not the operations man whose face arranged itself into whatever expression seemed safest. Even the receptionist forgot to pretend. The city watched through the glass. From the back of the room came a sound not meant for boardrooms, the slow hush of a broom along a clean floor, followed by the bump of a rubber wheel against a chrome cart. A woman in a navy uniform stood, paused as if at a border, gloved hands resting upon the handle of the cart, a headband keeping hair from her face. Her eyes were calm, too calm, and then she did something in that quiet that no one there could have rehearsed for. She raised her hand. "I did it," she said. "The design is mine." Silence made itself larger. For a beat, what had been spoken did not fit the logic of the room. The executives flicked glances at one another, the way swimmers look for the ladder they thought would be there. One manager let out a sound that was meant to be a laugh and died into a cough. Damon took up the page and carried it to the woman, stopping close enough for the paper to rustle in the current of quietly panicked breath. He angled the sheet so the light cut across the pencil work. These curves, this light treatment, the airflow through the solar glass. He didn't ask if she understood. He stated what he saw. You designed this. She nodded. Every line. The HR director, Sandra, whose posture had the unyielding confidence of policy manuals, crossed her arms. With respect, you're a janitor, she said. We have credentialing for a reason. I have the credentials, the woman replied, and it was not defiance so much as the exhaustion of having to state a fact nobody had ever bothered to ask for. My name is Joyce Miller. I have an architecture degree from MIT. One of the directors forgot how to swallow and coughed coffee back into his cup. A young analyst shifted in his seat, shame traveling up his neck. She sometimes sketches on the design floor at night, he muttered. We thought it was, I don't know, doodling, Sandra supplied, the word landing with a cold smallness. Damon did not look at Sandra. He kept his eyes upon Joyce as if watching a horizon realign. Sit, he said, indicating the central chair. The chair of prestige, of presentations that could move millions or doom them. I want to hear everything. Joyce hesitated, but not because she was unsure. It was the small shock of being invited past a threshold that had for years been a pane of glass and a joke. She removed a glove with deliberate care, as if shedding a skin that had become both armor and cage, and sat. The receptionist, through the glass, took her hands off the keyboard altogether. You don't get to see moments like this every day, she thought, though she would never say it aloud. How does someone with your background end up on the night shift? Damon asked. Not accusation. Curiosity with the gravity turned on. I had a daughter, Joyce said, and for the first time her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a vibration from some depth you cannot reach without surviving the worst. Lauren, 6 years old. She loved buildings. I used to let her draw beside me. There was an accident. She died. She said the words in a way that did not ask for pity. It allowed the truth to stand with its shoes on. After that, I sold my firm. I couldn't look at a blueprint without feeling like someone had moved the ground under me. I came here because I needed to be invisible. A mop is a kind of silence. Sandra shifted, finding footing in procedure because grief was a country she refused to travel. If you had an MIT degree, why didn't you declare it in your application? I filled it out, Joyce said, but no one reads the resumes of the cleaning staff. You skimmed. You stamped. I got a schedule. Damon looked at the men and women whose bonuses depended upon claiming they could spot talent through walls. Some studied their nails. One squinted heroically at the skyline. This proposal, why submit it anonymously? To see if the work could speak without a name, Joyce said. Not just mine. Anyone's. I studied your rejected designs and listened for the reasons they died, cost, compliance, the fear of being first, and I drew a version that solved the fear instead of decorating it. She glanced at the paper in his hand. If it wasn't good enough, it would drift away like all the other sheets. If it was, it would find the table. Damon's mouth almost found a smile, and then reconsidered, not out of stinginess, but because the moment was too new. It found the table. He turned to the room. As of this moment, Joyce Miller is no longer on janitorial staff. She joins the design group. Sandra exhaled an incredulous sound. You can't simply... Damon cut her off politely, the way a guillotine is polite. It is quick. We will not continue a culture in which a genius must disguise herself as invisible to be heard, he said. If your processes prevent us from seeing, then the processes are fired. If your pride prevents you from hearing, then your pride is fired. The meeting bled back into the day like a wound stitched closed, but the story unspooled along the corridors faster than gossip. The janitor is an architect. The architect is a janitor. The roomer tried on both sentences and liked the taste of each. On the 32nd floor, where the old brainstorming lounge smelled faintly of marker ink and lost sleep, Joyce returned that night as she always did, before she had a badge that would make others look twice. The overhead lights flickered once and surrendered to steadiness. On a corner table, she arranged the pages she had kept hidden, hands smoothing paper the way a mother smooths the hair of a sleeping child. The drawings were the first true work she had made since the day death took the chair at her table and would not be asked to leave. They did not avoid grief. They made rooms for it, spaces where air and green and public welcome intersected so that loss might not be less, but a person could be more than their wound. She slid the best of them into a neutral folder and left it on the floor where executives believed magic came from, the 34th. In the days that followed, Damon requested a second meeting, not to test her with traps, but to watch her think in daylight. He summoned the senior designers to a room that had never been this quiet with their bodies in it. "You've all had weeks to produce a design for the Boston Innovation Center," he said. "What I've seen would embarrass the word average. We're going to do something you cannot decorate with slides. 60 minutes. No software, paper, pencils, brains. Create a space that merges sustainability, public accessibility, and architectural boldness in a restricted urban zone." A hand rose. "With teams, surely?" someone asked, already preparing the list of people to blame. "No teams," Damon said. "No alibis. Joyce participates." A few made sounds behind their teeth, the engineering equivalent of eye-rolling. The clock began. When it was Joyce's turn to present, she did not preface, apologize, or sprinkle words like innovation upon the paper as if it were seasoning. She pinned her drawing to the board and let the room see. "A public research center," she said. "Elevated gardens that collect storm water and temper heat islands. Solar reflective glass that bends light into corridors rather than bouncing it into the sky. Natural ventilation carved by the building itself. A central atrium shaped like an open flower, a geometry taken from a drawing my daughter made." She could say Lauren's name in a room now without folding. "This is meant to be used, not admired from across the street by people who do not feel invited." The room's resistance did not puncture so much as deflate. A skeptic cleared his throat and remembered an appointment elsewhere. Sandra spoke from her chair in the back without standing. "A nice sketch," she said. "Perhaps if we're curating a gallery." But structures must stand. Protocols must be followed. Damon turned, a patient weatherfront building into a storm. "What you hear in her work," he said to the room, "frightens you because it is both visionary and practical. You are not used to both. That is not the world's fault." He produced a folder, the real kind, ink on paper. "This is Joyce's promotion packet," he said, and the room understood the past tense within the present. "Lead designer for Boston." Sandra laughed, a sound that dried the air. "What next?" she said. "Hiring interns to pour foundations." Joyce looked at her. Really looked. As at a person whose job had told her that rules were the last safe religion. "Maybe the next step," Joyce said quietly, "is teaching executives to see below their own ceilings." Damon allowed himself the smallest smile. Then he turned back to Sandra. "Thank you for your service," he said. And it was not cruel. It was simply the end of a sentence. Your view of leadership doesn't fit the future we are building." That night, in a small Harlem apartment, Joyce placed her uniform over the back of a kitchen chair and sat at the edge of her bed like someone who has walked a long distance with a stone in her shoe and finally taken it out to name it. From beneath the bed, she drew a cardboard box whose corners were softened by years. Inside was a life arrested mid-stride, an MIT degree, awards that once seemed like promises, letters from mentors who had believed in a bright, specific future with her name on it. On top lay a child's drawing, a flower of a building, and a sentence in pink. "Mommy, I want to live in something you design. Lauren." Joyce let her fingers rest upon the paper until the trembling steadied. She set the drawing back into the box as one sets the heart back into the chest and rose to her desk. There was a blank page waiting. She wrote at the top for the voices that were silenced before they could be heard, and began to sketch not as an escape from her grief, but as a door through it. 2 days later, Damon asked her to the private boardroom, all glass and skyline, and the kind of table that had never borne the weight of a lunchbox. He held a sleek folder embossed with her name in gold. "The board approved your promotion," he said. "Senior Creative Director for the Boston Initiative. You'll manage a team of 50. Joyce looked out at the river and did not think of the heights, but of the ground. "I accept," she said. "On one condition." He waited. "I want to build the team myself, not just the usual suspects. I want the city's unnamed talent, people who were told they didn't look like the future." "You're describing an alternate pipeline," he said, curious. "I'm describing tearing down a wall," she answered. "There's a woman in Queens who designs playgrounds by hand on evenings after cooking for a family of 6. No one has given her an interview. A Haitian architect in Brooklyn hauling cement by day because his credentials arrived at JFK and disappeared somewhere between the tarmac and an office. A teenager in the Bronx who rebuilt a community garden out of pallets and perseverance. They understand foundations because they've lived on them." "Bring me their names," Damon said. "Let's build it your way." They called it the Root Project because the metaphor contained both truth and instruction. Talent grows under the surface where the light of prestige does not reach. The people Joyce recruited wore backpacks instead of leather briefcases, carried calluses, carried accents, carried neighborhoods in their pockets. Some sat at the edge of the table for the first time and apologized for taking up space. Joyce moved their chairs in quietly and began. Work gathered like weather slow, then all at once. Engineers who had once treated community groups as an afterthought learned to hold workshops in school gyms where children drew desire lines with crayons. Procurement folks reread bylaws to discover which musts were only habits wearing suits. A code specialist who had been told he was too blunt to lead became invaluable for saying no in time to save millions and yes when the rules had been written by fear. Arguments were had. Some were loud. The loudest and best ended in design revisions that made the building more true to the people it claimed to serve. Joyce moved through it all with a steadiness that did not pretend she had never been broken. Sometimes, alone at her desk in the last hour of evening office light, she would touch the edge of Lauren's drawing and find the room again. Grief did not leave. It learned to sit beside purpose without snuffing it. Months turned their pages. Steel rose. Glass found its frames. On a cold morning that made breath visible, a crowd gathered in downtown Boston, where the building had grown as if the ground had remembered something and offered it back. The stage was the temporary kind that holds permanent moments. Reporters stood ready with formulaic questions the city would not mind hearing. But the first rows were not the usual. cafeteria workers in good shirts, sanitation crews off their shift, night nurses whose mouths kept the memory of coffee though their cups were empty. They had cleaned up after ribbon cuttings their whole lives. Today, they had invitations that did not require them to pretend they were passing by. Damon spoke first. He did not attempt inspiration. He told a story. "When I first saw the blueprint for this place, he said, I thought it was impossible. Then I met the person who drew it and realized the only impossible thing was pretending that talent wears one uniform." He turned, offering the stage. "Please welcome our lead architect and the founder of the Root Project, Joyce Miller." Joyce stepped forward in a navy dress, the color of a life she had decided not to hide from anymore. Pinned at her shoulder was a small white flower that would not have mattered to anyone who had not seen a child's drawing and used it as a compass. She stood at the lectern and let the sound of the crowd reduce to a hum. She did not need to clear her throat. "I spent years cleaning the floors of this industry," she said, and there was a ripple in the first row's recognition. "The hardest part wasn't the mop. It was being unseen in the very places I dreamed of shaping. Once a little girl told me she wanted to live in something I designed." She paused, her hands quiet upon the lectern, steady in the way of people who have stopped bargaining with their pain. "This is for Lauren." She spoke then not about innovation in the abstract, but about the very human math that makes a building belong to its people, that a breeze can be part of a heating system, that a lobby can welcome without policing, that a roof can be an orchard, that beauty is not a trick but a duty. She said it plain, and it felt like someone had translated an old, difficult text into a language the city already knew. After the applause receded to a soft sea, she walked off the stage not toward the VIP tent, but to the knot of Root Project designers who had waited with their nervous, fierce faces. She flipped her badge and wrote, "For Lauren. We built this together." The marker squeaked, and for a second the sound was the loudest thing in the world. People moved into the building and were surprised to find it moved them back. A teacher led a line of fourth graders through the atrium, and they looked up as if the ceiling were the sky. Two elder men, veterans of every change the neighborhood had endured, sat on a bench in the winter garden and argued companionably about which baseball team knew more about patience. A nurse from the night shift put a hand flat on the solar glass and felt warmth travel through a palm calloused by care. They did not know the language of LED and did not need to. The building spoke theirs. The company changed in the way real change looks from the inside. Not like fireworks, but like daylight arriving at the same reliable hour and slowly convincing the room there is more to see. Hiring practices were rewritten by people who understood that talent and privilege are not synonyms. The design floor became a place where questions were not performative, and answers could come from anyone. A receptionist's idea about queue flow saved thousands of hours no consultant had noticed. An electrician's suggestion about the sensor placement cut energy use and was adopted company-wide with a quiet memo bearing his name at the top. Joyce did not become a legend to herself. Legends are marble. She had been a mop. Instead, she became a person who walked at the speed of trust. She took interns from neighborhoods that could not afford unpaid hope and paid them. She taught a seminar called Foundations in a windowless conference room at 7 in the morning, because that's when the construction crews were between shifts. She sometimes left a pad of paper in the old brainstorming lounge on the 32nd floor, with nothing on it but a note. Draw, and the room will listen. People did. The drawings were rough and wrong, and then less so. A few were excellent. One, by a young woman who delivered packages nights and took classes by day, made Damon close his eyes for a moment, the way you do when grace surprises you in your own building. The company did not become gentle, exactly. It became accurate. Accuracy about what talent looks like is kinder than kindness. Sandra's desk remained empty for a week, then 2. Then a new person filled it. Not with fear, but with forms that matched the world better. Policies changed. Not overnight, and not because a memo ordered it, but because the rooms that made decisions now contained people who had been invisible and refused to be again. You would be forgiven for thinking this a story about a CEO's good eye or a single act of bravery at the back of a room. It is about that, a little. Mostly, it is about what happens when silence is exchanged for speech. When a woman who has carried grief like a second spine chooses to stand where she can be seen. When an institution built to admire itself lets the city in and discovers there is more to admire. Some evenings, late, Joyce would ride the elevator alone to the 34th floor to look at the city the way a sailor looks at a harbor he can finally name. The glass would hold her reflection and then let it go. She would think of a girl in denim overalls, a safety helmet too large for her head, a crayon drawing held up with the insistence of children who do not understand why the world should take so long to become itself. Joyce would touch the pin at her shoulder, a small white flower, and stay there long enough for the lights of the other buildings to become not competitors, but constellations. Once on a quiet Sunday, she unlocked the Boston building when it was not open and walked through it without an entourage. She stood beneath the atrium's flower geometry and looked up until the edges blurred into a sky that was not there and was. She sat on a bench and pulled a notebook from her bag. A security guard recognized her from the ceremony and gave a small, embarrassed wave. She waved back and asked his name. He told her. She wrote it down. People like to be held in the memory of a place. She began to draw again, not because something was missing, but because something had arrived. A new center for the South Side of Chicago. A clinic that felt like a garden for a city that had forgotten the shape of mercy. A library in a town where the last factory had long ago gone quiet. Designed so the silence afterward did not feel like absence but like a pause before a song. She drew the first lines the way a person says the first true sentence after years of careful speech. On paper, in buildings, and in the rooms where decisions are made, a different blueprint was taking root, one that did not ask people to become less of themselves to be allowed into the future. It had always been there, beneath the pavements and policies. Like water under stone, Joyce had simply raised her hand and said, "I did it." And in the space after those words, a company and a city remembered how to listen. If you were to walk past the Boston Innovation Center at dusk, you might notice the way the glass holds the city and the way the gardens lift green into the sky. You might not know the story, or you might know it and tell it wrong in the way stories prefer they like to grow. To pick up details that do not belong and wear them until they do. You might see a custodian clocking in for the night, a badge catching the last light. You might see a group of young designers step out the doors to argue in the friendly, fierce way the future demands. You might see a woman pause on the steps and look upward with an expression that contains, in equal measure, sorrow and victory. What you would not see is the moment the room froze and the broom slid and a hand rose. That was years ago, and also still happening, constantly. Wherever someone insists that excellence looks one way and the world answers with a different, better shape. Buildings teach if we let them. This one says, roots first, then everything else. At the end of Joyce's journey, the lesson is simple but demanding. Excellence doesn't wear a uniform, and grief can become a blueprint for grace. We build better worlds when we look past titles, ask the second question, and make room at the table for voices we've trained ourselves not to hear. This week, choose to see. Learn a name you've walked by. Invite a quiet talent into the conversation. And measure leadership by who gets included, not who gets impressed. And if you're carrying a private sorrow, let purpose give it shape. Let your gift speak until the room learns to listen. In the comments, tell us about a time you were unseen or the moment you finally saw someone else. Who will you invite to the table this week? If this story moved you, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next everyday miracle. Share this with someone who needs to be seen.